There are people in American history that the country could never quite file correctly. Too free to be called escaped slaves, too black to be counted as Indians, too organized to be a footnote, and too inconvenient to be remembered at all. The records that tried to define them ended up erasing them instead, sorting them into a box that hid what they actually were. For a century, that filing held. Then DNA and the documents together began to pull the box apart, and what stepped out was a nation no one had bothered to name. Let's establish the ground we're standing on, because the claim is unusual and it needs real evidence under it, not legend. There is now peer-reviewed genetic work on exactly the population these people came from. A study published in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology mapped the genetic landscape of the Gullah, the African-American community of the Sea Islands off Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, to test where, in Africa, their ancestry actually pointed, and to weigh the popular Sierra Leone homeland story against the data. A second, more recent study went looking specifically at the Gullah Geechee maternal line, the ancestry passed strictly from mother to child, and surfaced a pattern nobody expected. And alongside the genetics, there is the documentary record, Spanish colonial edicts, U.S. Army correspondence, treaty papers, and the federal enrollment rolls that tried, a century ago, to sort every person in Indian Territory into a single racial category. Put those two kinds of evidence together, the genome on one side, the paper trail on the other, and you can do something the old story never allowed. You can check the official version against the body and against the archive at the same time and see exactly where they agree and where one of them was lying. When you do, the neat label these people were given starts to come apart at every seam. The group in question has gone by many names: Black Seminoles, Seminole Maroons, Seminole Freedmen, the Estelusti, the Mescogos of Mexico, the Black Indians of the Bahamas. That tangle of names is itself a clue, a sign of a people who kept slipping out of every category anyone tried to hold them in. To understand why none of those names alone captures them, you have to go back to a swamp and a promise made by the King of Spain. It begins on the Rice Coast. Through the early 17 and 1800s, the people who would become the Gullah were concentrated on the rice and indigo plantations of coastal South Carolina and Georgia. Africans drawn heavily from the rice-growing regions of West Africa, brought precisely because they carried the agricultural knowledge that made the low-country plantations profitable. Their relatively large numbers and the geographic isolation of the Sea Islands let them hold onto more of their African languages, beliefs, and social structures than almost any other enslaved community in North America, forging a distinct Creole culture that survives to this day. And from the very beginning, some of them ran. They ran south into Spanish Florida because Spain had made them an offer. As early as the 1690s, the Spanish crown declared that enslaved people who fled the English colonies and reached Florida would be granted their freedom in exchange for defending Spanish St. Augustine and converting to Catholicism. Spain didn't do this out of conscience. Florida's native population had been devastated by disease and slave raids, and the Spanish needed bodies to hold the line against the English to the north. So they made a cold strategic calculation: turn England's escaped property into Florida's armed defenders. For the people who made the desperate run south, though, the calculation behind the offer didn't matter. What mattered was that freedom, for the first time, lay at the end of the journey. In 1738, those freedom seekers built a fortified town near St. Augustine called Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose, Fort Mose, and it became the first legally sanctioned free black town in what is now the United States. Free, armed, sanctioned by a crown, decades before the Declaration of Independence was ever signed. As more Africans escaped into the Florida wilderness, they encountered another group of refugees, the people who would become the Seminole, themselves breakaway bands of Creek and other nations moving south away from colonial violence. The two groups recognized something in each other. Both were fugitives from the same expanding empire. Both were rebuilding a life in the same unforgiving swamp. And here's the detail: The popular story almost always gets wrong. The Black Maroons and the Seminole did not simply merge into one people. They formed an alliance between two distinct communities. The Maroons built their own towns, grew their own crops of rice and corn, kept their own leadership, and spoke their own language, Afro-Seminole Creole, a cousin of Gullah, carrying African words and grammar alongside borrowings from Spanish, English, and the Muskogee tongue of the Seminole. They often paid the Seminole a tribute in crops, and in return they gained protection from the slave catchers always prowling the Florida border. There was intermarriage, and there was deep cooperation. And over time, the lines between the communities did blur in places. But at their core, they remained, in the words of historians, separate and symbiotic. The Black Seminoles were not absorbed into someone else's nation. They built their own, in the open, while the most powerful slave society on earth sat just across the border, furious that it existed at all. So here's the first thing the records get backwards, and it is a big one. The popular memory, when it remembers these people at all, files them as escaped slaves who hid among the Indians, passive fugitives who found shelter under someone else's protection. That is almost the opposite of the truth. The Black Seminoles were among the most militarily formidable free Black communities in the history of North America, and they fought for their freedom across decades in open war against the most powerful army on the continent. When the United States moved to seize Florida and break up these maroon havens, it triggered a series of wars. Andrew Jackson's invasion in the First Seminole War had breaking up the Black settlements as one of its explicit aims, but it was the Second Seminole War, fought from 1835 to 1842, that became the longest and most expensive war the United States waged against Native Americans in the entire 19th century, costing tens of millions of dollars and the lives of thousands of soldiers. And the Black Seminoles were at the heart of it, because they had the most to lose. For the Seminole, defeat meant removal to the west. For the Black Seminoles, defeat meant something worse: re-enslavement, the return to chains they or their parents had escaped, the undoing of everything generation had fought to build. They fought with a desperation the U.S. Army learned to fear, and they fought with skill, drawing on military traditions that stretched back to Fort Mose and beyond. The commanding American general, Thomas Jessup, came to a striking conclusion about what he was actually fighting. He concluded that this was, in essence, not an Indian war at all, but a Black one, a war driven above all by people determined never to be property again. It was an extraordinary admission. The United States had stumbled into a prolonged war against a free Black nation it refused to admit existed. Leaders emerged whose names deserve to be as known as any in American history. There was Abraham, a formerly enslaved man who became a brilliant interpreter and advisor, negotiating at the highest levels between the Seminole, the Maroons, and the United States government. And above all, there was John Horse, also known as Juan Caballo, and John Cavallo, a Black Seminole warrior and diplomat who would fight, negotiate, escape, and lead his people across not one country, but three, in a pursuit of freedom that spanned half a century. These were not people hiding in a swamp. These were soldiers and statesmen of a nation that simply had never been granted the dignity of being called one. Now, where does the DNA come in, and what does it actually reveal about who these people were underneath the labels? To get there, we need one specific tool, and it works in a way that's easy to picture. Most of your DNA gets shuffled and recombined every generation. Your four grandparents' contributions blended together until the individual threads are hard to follow. But there is one piece that doesn't shuffle: the DNA inside your mitochondria, the tiny power plants in your cells, is passed down almost unchanged from mother to child, generation after generation, along a single unbroken female line. Think of it as a surname that only mothers pass on, never overwritten, traceable, back through your mother, her mother, her mother, for thousands of years. Scientists sort these maternal lines into branches of the human family tree, and each branch is called a haplogroup because the maternal line doesn't blend. A haplogroup is one of the cleanest signals we have of deep ancestral origin. When researchers looked at the maternal haplogroups of the Gula, most pointed exactly where the history says they should, to west, in West Central Africa, the deep African roots of the Rice Coast people, branches of the human family tree that trace back to the great African maternal lineages. But a recent study of Gullah Geechee maternal lineages turned up something that the simple, they were African, they were black story cannot explain. Alongside the African lines, the data showed maternal haplogroups belonging to lineages found in Native American populations. The particular branches, designated by letters like A and B, that mark the founding maternal lines of the indigenous Americas. The unbroken female line, the one record that cannot be faked or filed away by a census taker, carried Native American ancestry in some of these families, passed down, mother to daughter, exactly as you would expect if Black and Native people had been having children together for generations, which the history tells us they were. Think about what that means against the paperwork. A clerk could glance at a person, decide they looked Black, and write 0 in the column for Indian blood. But that clerk could not reach into the person's mitochondria and change the haplogroup their great-grandmother's grandmother had carried out of an indigenous community. The researchers are appropriately cautious, and they say more work is needed, but the signal is there in the one part of the genome that doesn't lie about descent, and that sets up the deepest reversal of all, the moment where the documents and the DNA openly contradict each other, and you can prove which one was lying. After the wars, the surviving Seminole and Black Seminoles were forced west to Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. Decades later, around the turn of the 20th century, the U.S. government set out to enroll every member of the so-called 5 tribes on official lists, the Dawes Rolls, in order to break up communal tribal land and parcel it out to individuals. And the way the federal commissioners filled out those rolls would shape the identity of thousands of people for the next 100 years. The commissioners sorted everyone into categories: Indian, by blood, intermarried whites, and freedmen, the term for people formerly enslaved by the tribes and their descendants. Blood quantum, the practice of assigning a person a fraction of Indian blood, was itself a foreign concept imported by the non-native census takers, a measurement that traditional tribal identity, rooted in clan and kinship, had never used. It was estimated on the spot, often from nothing more than a glance at a person's skin and a clerk's personal opinion. And here is the poison at the center of it. If a person looked Black, the commissioners frequently wrote them down as a freedman and recorded their Indian blood as 0, even when that person had a native parent or grandparent, even when their native ancestry was a matter of plain community knowledge. A one-drop rule run in reverse. 1 drop of Black blood, and your native ancestry was simply struck from the paper as if it had never existed. Many freedmen were by descent also native. The roll said otherwise, and over the following century, the rolls hardened into law, becoming the document that tribes themselves would later use to decide who counted and who did not. The consequences are still unfolding in courtrooms today. In a 2024 case before Oklahoma's highest criminal court, a Seminole freedman descendant, a man of documented Estalusta ancestry whose tribal card listed his Indian blood as 0/0, offered 2 DNA tests indicating he did in fact carry Native American ancestry. The court set the DNA aside, giving controlling weight to the blood quantum printed on the century-old roll and questioning the reliability of commercial tests. Whatever one thinks of that legal outcome, look at what the moment represents. A man's own genome said one thing. A document filled out by a stranger 100 years earlier, based partly on the color of an ancestor's skin, said another, and the document still won. The DNA was telling the truth the paper had been built to hide. Before the last turn, let me say plainly why this channel exists. It's to give you the documented version of these histories, checkable, sourced, and honest about both what we know and what we don't. If that's the work you want more of, subscribe, because the official record left enormous gaps where whole peoples used to be, and filling them back in with the truth is the entire point of what we do here. Now I have to be careful about what the DNA does and does not settle, because here the honesty matters more than anywhere else in the story. This is the part that cannot be skipped because it would be easy to twist this story into something it isn't. First and most important, DNA does not determine who belongs to a tribe. Tribal citizenship is a matter of sovereignty. Each native nation has the right to decide its own membership, and it has historically been rooted in kinship, community, language, and shared life, not in a percentage from a laboratory. Showing that a freedman descendant carries native ancestry does not by itself settle the citizenship dispute. And anyone who tells you a cheek swab can override a nation's right to define itself is misunderstanding both the science and the sovereignty. The freedmen's citizenship fight, which flared when the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma moved in 2000 to exclude two freedmen bands from a land claim settlement, is a genuine and painful conflict with real grievances and real history on more than one side. It is a wound the United States deliberately created by imposing racial categories on nations that hadn't used them, and it is not mine or a DNA test to resolve. Second, the African origins themselves are more complicated than the Romantic version. There's a beloved narrative that the Gula came specifically from Sierra Leone. Built on real and striking evidence, Sea Islanders and Sierra Leoneans can partly understand each other's Creole speech, and they share rice farming techniques, songs, and stories. It's a powerful connection, and it's not wrong. But the genetic and shipping evidence points to a broader picture. The records of the Charleston slave trade show the largest share of captives actually came from West Central Africa, the Congo, and Angola region at around 39%, with Senegambia at about 20%, and the Windward Coast, the Gold Coast, Sierra Leone, and others making up the rest. The Rice Coast connection is real, and the Sierra Leone links are genuine, but the Gullah are a blend of many African peoples woven together in the Low Country, not the descendants of a single tidy homeland. The truth is richer and messier than the legend, which is usually how truth works. Third, the maternal lineage finding of native ancestry is recent, based on limited samples, and flagged by its own authors as needing more research. It is a real and tantalizing signal, not a closed case, and I won't overstate it. And we should remember that the relationship between these communities was never simple or always equal. The Seminole themselves practiced their own form of bondage, a milder, tribute-based system in which the enslaved lived in their own villages and kept much of what they grew, but bondage nonetheless. And British and colonial agents sometimes handed enslaved people to Seminole chiefs as gifts to seal alliances. The story of Black and Native people in the Southeast is one of alliance and intermarriage, but also of hierarchy and tension. Honest history holds all of that complexity at once and resists the urge to flatten it into a single heroic or villainous shape. What survives all of it is the core truth. The Black Seminoles were a real, distinct, self-made people, African in root and often Native in blood, whose actual origins were richer than any single box the country ever tried to put them in. So let's bring it home, because the most extraordinary part of this story is what these people did with the freedom no one wanted to grant them. When removal to Oklahoma brought the renewed threat of re-enslavement, with slave raiders and rival claimants circling the Black Seminoles, even in Indian territory, John Horse did not surrender to it. In 1849 and 1850, he led a band of Black Seminoles alongside the Seminole leader Wildcat on an exodus out of the United States entirely, a dangerous journey across Texas and over the Rio Grande into Mexico, which had already abolished slavery and which offered them land in exchange for guarding its northern frontier against raiders. There they became known as the Muskogos, and they held up their end of the bargain as fierce frontier fighters. Their descendants live in the town of Nacimiento in northern Mexico to this day, still keeping traditions and a Creole speech carried out of the American South. Years later, after the Civil War ended slavery in the United States, the U.S. Army came looking for them, recruiting their famed trackers and fighters back across the border to serve as the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts, guarding the brutal Texas frontier through the 1870s and beyond. They were regarded as some of the finest scouts the Army ever fielded, and 4 of those scouts, Adam Payne, Pompey Factor, Isaac Payne and John Ward earned the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest decoration for valor. Medals given to men whose own country had, within living memory, classified their families as property to be bought and sold. It may well be the sharpest irony the entire American story has ever produced. Sit with the shape of that journey, from the rice fields of the Carolinas, to a fort built free under a Spanish flag, to maroon towns in the Florida swamps, to the longest Indian war in American history, to an armed exodus into Mexico, to the Medal of Honor on the Texas plains. One people carried that whole arc, and they carried it as a nation, with a language still spoken today in Texas and in Mexico, with their own churches, their own burial grounds, their own annual gatherings, their own unbroken memory. They were never the passive fugitives of the textbook footnote, and they were never the blank freedmen of the federal roll. Those were boxes built by other people for other people's convenience. Their true origin was never a category at all. It was a decision made over and over across 2 centuries and 3 countries. The decision, in the face of an entire continent organized to deny it, to be free. The DNA can show the African rice coast roots and the native maternal lines the paperwork tried to erase. But the deepest thing it confirms is simpler. These people were exactly who they always said they were. The records were the lie. The blood and the long walk to freedom were the truth.